An American's city's quality of life is actually entirely in the hands of both leading families, as we demonstrated here, and city planners. And over my 4 years here, I've often heard the explanation that we don't have oceans or mountains, to excuse our middling status as a magnet for young Hoosiers who are tempted away by other cities, or as a destination for those who might otherwise consider moving here. And what I say when I hear that we don't have oceans or mountains is, neither do London, Paris, Madrid, Dallas, Las Vegas, or Atlanta, and they don't seem to have any problems attracting millions of people who want to live there or visit there. So unless we want to build a mountain, we could do that. We've got the power. We're Hoosiers. We can come together. We can build ourselves a mountain. Or let's stop talking about that, because these other cities don't seem to worry about not having a mountain. What we in fact lack here is architectural and design vision and determination, the kind of vision that creates other cities' greatness. And I urge us to stop talking about oceans and mountains and focus on building a great city we can point to with pride. The quality of life of this city is deeply compromised, not just by the lack of compelling city planning and compelling architecture, it's also the lack of an adequate cultural center downtown, and by the lack of public support of culture. If, as I've said, we can tolerate tax subsidies for the sports industry, we should also be able to tolerate tax subsidies for civic architecture and for cultural investment that open the eyes of our young and keep them here, entice other families to call Indiana home, and contribute to a more progressive worldview for all. And by progressive, I'm saying cultural leaders, from those who built Lincoln Center to those who advocate public support of the arts in Indiana. I intend a more open-minded, tolerant, and accepting worldview through exposure to the multiple lessons of creativity. Our symphony and IRT repertory theater play in rehabilitated movie theaters. Let's not paper it over. That's what they are. They're great, but they weren't built for that, and they have to compromise every day of the year. We don't have an opera house. We have no ballet stage. And the only year-round avant-garde cinema is where you're sitting today. So when you step away from that for a minute and think, is this really what we want to be as a city? Is that the extent to which we're willing to commit, while so many other cities have made and anchored their identities in the furtherance of cultural investment? It's a question worth asking. In Paris and London and New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, art museums are the top tourist destinations, far ahead of stadiums and other entertainment-focused attractions. But our efforts here have been otherwise and elsewhere. And while many have questioned the logic of Carmel investing massively in a cultural center, I think the real question is, why is that not happening in downtown Indianapolis? You know, Lincoln Center's focus was broadly on the performing arts, but that's simply because New York City and New Yorkers were already heavily invested in multiple art museums, including most notably the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which today has a $350 million annual operating budget, over 10 times the size of our budget. And in its last tax filing, the Met received $21 million in a direct grant from the city and $10 million in in-kind support for its facilities. For example, it doesn't pay its energy bills. The city of New York pays Con Edison its energy bills. So 10% of its budget year in, year out comes from the city of New York. The vast majority of its support, like ours, comes from individuals and endowment. But by contrast to the Metropolitan Museum, our city's flagship art museum, the one in which you sit, receives tens of thousands of dollars annually. 1/3 of 1% of our budget is from government. And when you look at that and you say, how does that compare? We look around the Midwest, just starting there. The Art Institute of Chicago got more than $6.5 million last year. The Minneapolis Institute of Arts got more than $12 million from a city tax levy. St. Louis Art Museum, $20 million last year. And in those cities that our Chamber of Commerce travels to now to look at as models, Charlotte, more than $5 million in public funding for the arts. Denver, $40 million annually from 1 cent on $10 of sales tax. So those are examples of other cities that have walked up to this challenge and agreed that the families can only do so much. The families have done so much, and think of what they've spawned in the Lilly Endowment and other charitable organizations, the Nina Mason Pulliam Trust. The greatness of philanthropy around our city is indisputable. But we cannot continue to rely on that as our sole and exclusive province of individual wealth and foundations. We've seen how corporations have found it difficult to support the arts in recent years, and we're losing the capacity to take the hundreds of thousands of people who cross into our campus every year, who come here to learn the stories of art, the stories of history, the stories of human interaction, and develop an appreciation of the international scene here, we can't tell those stories as effectively because we are reliant entirely on the generosity of people, not through the agency of government. It was interesting also that New York's heavy concentration of museums before groundbreaking began on Lincoln Center had an effect. It meant, however, that the visual arts were absolutely indispensable to Lincoln Center, and they were part of the founding intent. So commissions and acquisitions of works there by Alexander Calder and Marc Chagall and Jasper Johns and Henry Moore were among the earliest commitments to public art in Lincoln Center. But interestingly, notwithstanding New York's preeminence in the 1950s and 60s as the center of the art world, not one of those artists called New York their permanent home. And one of the shibboleths of the art world outside of New York is that preference should be given to those visual artists who are described as local artists. I introduced this phenomenon to acknowledge that imagination, from the title of our conference, is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It needs to spring from proven creative talent and spawn art of high quality, as substantiated by authoritative and discerning critics and curators, and eventually by the marketplace. If art is going to flourish in any part of the United States, it's all well and good to promote the work of artists in any particular vicinity, but it's a concession to mediocrity to argue that they are any more entitled to a preferential market than any other vendor of goods or services in a town or city. We were just talking at our table about local restaurants. We all feel a need to patronize independent restaurants when they're launched as an alternative to our city's vaunted chain restaurants. But there are some restaurants that don't work, and they have to get the message. If no one continues patronizing them, maybe you should take up cooking at home on your own time. The choice to become a chef or an artist doesn't entitle you to support or success. You don't keep going to a restaurant that's nearby because it's nearby. An expectation that support should accrue to an artist from nearby, I'm saying, is a highly debatable construct, but it's a big part of the way our city operates. So that excursion, dangerous as it is for me, into the definition of an artist's reputation stands as a warning against the well-intentioned but misguided worship of imagination for its own sake. Within the realm of imagination, there are leaders and there are followers. And one would have to argue that Indianapolis and central Indiana has a ways to go before we can be seen as cultural leaders, whether as artists, critics, or arts administrators. The culture that we're in is one that needs to be pumped up to create aspiration in culture. And the cultivation and promulgation of artistic leadership is the essential fuel for investments in imaginative endeavors. What our city needs is the courage to look beyond its confines, to look not only within the state of Indiana, but to look more broadly, and to invite talent from without to inspire and train those who live here, and to encourage young Hoosiers to travel and obtain experiences elsewhere that they can bring home. If our only cultural efforts are homegrown, we can't expect distinction in our cultural crops. And that's true in the visual arts, in architecture, in urban planning, in arts administration, and in arts patronage. The leadership of our cultural organizations are predominantly from elsewhere, including your speaker. And just as is the case in the pursuit of scientific and athletic talent in Indiana, whether academic talent at IU and Purdue, the artistic companies that produce our greatest offerings recruit talent from elsewhere, such as the International Violin Competition, or the ISO, or the IRT, or the new Indianapolis City Ballet, and this art museum. This is in no way an indictment of Hoosiers. It is simply the case that with a population as small as ours, and a city that has avoided civic investment in culture, we must, for the most part, recruit talent from elsewhere and plant the seeds of their creativity in our young. That's the best way to foster a culture of innovation and openness to new ideas. If our reflex is to mine only local talent, whether in architecture, design, art, or athletics or science, we're denying Indianapolis the opportunity to compete on a more than local level. So instead of seeing this exhortation as an indictment of Indiana, it should instead be seen as urging the awakening of a new commitment to improving the quality of life for those who have been raised here or who might be tempted to move here. There will not be a brain drain if we can foster a climate of curiosity about the world at large instead of falling back on a stereotypical definition of who we are. Michael Jackson was raised in Gary, but his impact in the world of popular culture was neither dependent on a traditional Hoosier mindset nor a function of being from Indiana. Bruce Nauman, the artist who represented the U.S. in the last Venice Biennale in 2009, was born in Fort Wayne and made his career elsewhere. We claim these people as Hoosiers, we excuse their departure, and we make room for their achievements as something that we can hold on to. And that should be true of people who are either born and raised here or imported here or exported from here. It'll take a lot of years for Indianapolis and Indiana to nurture investment in the creative industries. And during that time, instead of insisting on a loyalty oath that no one will ever leave, I think we should encourage both comings and goings and challenge ourselves to be less insecure about our place in the world. The artistic companies in this city are fully capable of meeting competitive challenges on a global level, whether in the case of the violin competition or in this museum's representation of the United States in the Venice Biennale next June. Rather than bemoaning the paucity of homegrown Hoosiers who are artists and achieve international renown, we should put down the welcome mat and we should coax our young out of the nest to learn about the world. As headhunters like to say, it's very easy to persuade people to move to the Midwest, and it's impossible to get them to leave. So I think we have to think of a new perspective connected with that, one that is less hypersensitive and more realistic, less reflective of modesty and more competitive, less hidebound by tradition and more open to innovation. Because it's with that attitude and a push to invest in culture that we could create our own variant of Lincoln Center, not necessarily a single place, but an attitude of belief in pioneering strategies around cultural investment. Because the 2010 census is going to describe us as the second biggest city after Chicago in the Midwest. So I think we should seize that description. I think we should embolden ourselves to improve our city and our state through cultural investment and achieve a greater balance among investment in advanced research, sports, and culture. And in so doing, we would have a better city and a better state, one marked by investment in mind, body, and spirit. I was spending the last day with the Commissioner of Parks in New York City, Adrian Benepe, and he talks about how New York's culture and society was formed around fire, finance, insurance, and real estate. And he said the new methodology in New York City is to be around ice, which is basically the trinity that's quite different from that. It has to do with intellectual, cultural, and educational aspiration. I urge us nothing less. Thank you for coming today.